So thank you for joining us for this evening's Artist and Inspiration program. I'm Cheryl Bronstein, Director of Interpretation at the Adirondack Experience. And I do want to start this evening's program by acknowledging that the Adirondack Experience is situated on the Aboriginal territories of the Mohawk and Abenaki communities. Indigenous people continue to live in this region and practice their teachings and life ways. It may be snowing right now, but we at the Adirondack Experience are fully focused on what we have in store for you this summer. The museum will open our newest public permanent exhibition, Artists and Inspiration in the Wild, this July. You can check for construction and project updates on our website and on social media. This monthly speaker program, focused on the topics and the artists that will be featured in the exhibition, will continue as we prepare for the opening. We hope you continue to join us. Tonight's program is about one of the artists whose works will be featured in the exhibition, the most beloved Harold Weston. I am so pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Katie Wood Kirchhoff, who's curator of American Fine, Decorative, and Folk Arts at Shelburne Museum in Vermont. Katie received her BA in Art History from Smith College, her master's from the Winterthur Program in American Material Culture, and her PhD in Art History from the University of Delaware. Before coming to the Shelburne, she has held positions at the American Philosophical Society, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Winterthur Museum and Country Estate, and the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Throughout tonight's program, please feel free to submit any questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Katie will address questions after the presentation. Katie.
Thanks so much, Cheryl, for that gracious introduction. And another big thank you to everyone tuning in tonight for our conversation about 20th century American modernist painter Harold Weston. Over the course of the next half hour, we'll take some time to explore Weston's biography, his artistic practice, and his close ties to New York's Adirondack region. A small note, the shimmering, thickly painted image on the left side of the screen is a detail from a work you're going to be able to see in person very soon in the collection of the Adirondack Museum titled Giant, painted in 1922. More on this picture in a few minutes. In his 1971 autobiography, Freedom in the Wilds, An Artist in the Adirondacks, Harold Weston looked back on his life and confessed, quote, "I've been a devotee of the dews of the wilderness since childhood, and do not pretend to be without strong prejudices on its behalf." While Weston balanced a life of making art with advocacy for humanitarian causes across the globe, it was his love of the Adirondack wilderness that most defined his work. Weston was born on Valentine's Day, 1894 in Marion, Pennsylvania, into a creative, thoughtful family. His mother, Mary Hartshorn Weston, was a pianist, and his father, S. Burns Weston, was the founder of Philadelphia's Ethical Culture Society. Harold traveled widely as a child and summered in the Adirondack High Peaks with his family during his youth, hiking mountains, bushwhacking trails, paddling lakes, and sleeping atop fragrant beds of balsam boughs on overnight excursions. In 1911, polio left the vigorous 17-year-old with an emaciated leg, but Weston's strong will and compassion for the mountains fueled a resolve to overcome this physical challenge. Weston threw away his crutches, learned to use a cane, and got back to the business of living. He entered Harvard University in 1912, somewhat to his chagrin, and graduated 4 years later in 1916. Following college, Weston attended a limited range of classes at the Summer School of Graphic Arts in Ogunquit, Maine, and tried his hand at formal art classes at the Art Students League in New York City. In 1920, however, Weston decided to leave the city and make the mountains his year-round home. With the assistance of a local carpenter, Weston erected a one-room cabin in St. Hubert's, New York. This was to be a foundation that would allow him to immerse himself in a place he loved while pursuing art, according to his standards, full-time. You get a sense from this picture that you see here, this lovely photograph courtesy of the Harold Weston Foundation, that he really was sort of in the midst of a whole lot of trees and maybe not so many people. This becomes a theme in his art moving forward. Here you see him on top of Mount Marcy in 1922 with his sketchbox and paints. Giant Mountain, Gothics, Mount Marcy, and Indian Head are all iconic locations familiar to many visitors to the Adirondacks. But Harold Weston knew these places with an intimacy that extended beyond that of a casual observer. In the early 1920s, from the seclusion of his one-room cabin in St. Hubert's, he began to paint the wilds as he felt them. Weston's early paintings were inspired by the artist's deep love and appreciation for the natural beauty of the Adirondack region. Writing in Freedom in the Wilds, his biography, the artist recalled, quote, "I did a lot of wandering in the woods, up streams and climbing mountains, but always with my sketch box. I painted a great many small oil sketches on cardboard on the spot. A semi-pantheism permeated my reactions, the tree, cloud, and mountain, life in the eternal seen through the incandescence of the moment." And something that I won't spend too much time going into during our conversation tonight, but something that does bear a lot of relevance in our conversations about Harold Weston is how much the transcendentalists and contemporary American literature of the sort of first half of the 20th century and the last years of the 19th century inflected his writing. Characterized by bright colors and thick paint, Weston's expressive Adirondack landscapes from this period feature lakes, peaks, clouds, valleys, and forests brimming with life and energy. Writing for the American Federation of Art's Magazine of Art in 1939, he noted somewhat paradoxically that the subjects of his pictures often felt too expansive to capture on canvas, yet his finished pictures often seemed too small for large exhibitions and gallery walls. In these works, Weston strove to convey, quote, "an awareness of existence of which the painting is but a fragment." So in some ways, if we look back at sort of the production of art and we think about things that Weston's forebears had been doing, when we think about, for example, the Impressionists, both in Europe and America, the Impressionists were aiming to capture, the reflection of light off of objects. And there was a certain kind of energy and freedom that was sort of embodied in their brushwork. The same kind of expression is embodied in much of Weston's work, and in particular in his sketches. This particular work, graciously donated to the Shelburne Museum from the Harold Weston Foundation and Nina Weston, was painted in 1920 and is called Autumn Storm. If any of you have seen the remarkable sunsets that we've had lately before the coming snowstorms, you will, I don't know, perhaps the colors in this picture will resonate with you. I love sort of digging into these sketches and looking at the thick paint that's applied, and then thinking about how Weston has sort of worked his pencil over these sort of surfaces to get more contour in the mountains, and to sort of zhuzh up the color that he's sort of spilling onto, and on this case, a cardboard sketch pad. Weston's creative process brought the wilderness into the studio. He dashed out dozens of sketches featuring sites such as the mountains Colvin, McIntyre, and Baxter, en plein air or outdoors. Executed on small pieces of cardboard, completed studies could be safely stored and transported in the artist's sketchbox. And again, this is one of those sort of small sketches that Weston likely painted in 1921 while he was outdoors. And you get a real sense that perhaps the sun is behind him, reflecting off of these sort of hills that are right above the water. It's a lovely picture that I think many of us who live in this region understand because we see it with some frequency. Weston would take these small studies and work them into full-fledged oil-on canvas paintings in his studio. His journal entry from November 20th, 1921 provides insights regarding his working methods. Referencing his sketches, Weston wrote, quote, "I keep them all around in the wall niches of the studio and see if the composition stands. I've gotten in the way of doing a lot of different ones more or less at once. They seem to grow better that way. Two things impress me as more needed in my work: consistent virility and convincing rhythm of form and color." This picture, this is another sketch that is going to be on display at the Adirondack Museum when the exhibition opens in a few weeks. And one of the reasons that I wanted to use it for the purposes of our conversation tonight is the way that the colors in this particular sketch vibrate off of one another. As we were going through selecting images for this, as an art historian, I want to make sure that I'm sharing really good images so that you all out there can get a good view of what it is that we're talking about. And this picture I had to look at a number of times because the colors really do seem to sort of vibrate off of the page. And this is a color that, in September or maybe early October up here in New England, on those days where you get those sort of halcyon blue skies with all of those lovely leaves, I feel like Weston did a better job than most at capturing the kind of incandescence of all of that. Weston's first 2 winters in residence at his one-room studio in St. Hubert's were full of solitude, but they were not necessarily quiet. Looking back, Weston expressed gratitude toward his music collection. He said, quote, "I painted hundreds of little oil sketches out on the mountains, but the larger oils were not done from nature direct. If I felt the mood of a certain landscape was akin to the music of some composer, I would play my Victor records of it over and over while I painted." And you'll see this painting, Wilderness, a rendering of Marcy, with Dvorak's New World Symphony in Largo in the background. This is in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And you can sort of see in the way that the trees sort of arc up around the sides of the composition and the way that the sky sort of bends over them. You do get this sense, I think, of rhythm and a kind of musicality in much of his work. By the spring of 1922, Harold Weston felt it was time to share his pictures with the public. In April, the 28-year-old approached the New York City modernist gallery owner Newman Montross with, quote, "clammy hands and misgivings" regarding a possible show. Montross offered the gallery for a solo exhibition in November, giving Weston just 6 months to prepare. The artist chose to display a combination of Adirondack oil sketches on cardboard, like what we've been looking at, finished landscapes on canvas, and an assortment of additional compositions from his travels in Persia. He personally carved 63 unique frames for his Adirondack studio paintings and had them gilded in New York City. Almost all of the paintings in this gallery have been reunited. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Almost all of the paintings that he assembled in that show had these lovely hand-carved frames. And when we had an exhibition back in 2019 here at Shelburne Museum, we managed, with the help of Rebecca Foster and Nina Weston Foster, to bring some of those frames back. You'll see some of them in a few minutes. It was the largest sort of group of those that had managed to be brought together for very long, since November 1922. At any rate, the critics were enthusiastic at the Montross show. Something else that's worth noting here is that while Weston had been fully on board with the singular life of the artist in St. Hubert's, he longed for a partner. For most of 1922, he corresponded with and courted Faith Borton, a classmate of his sister's from Vassar. Most of this correspondence was conducted through letters. Writing to Faith Borton on November 5th, 1922, just 3 days before the public opening of the exhibition in New York, Wilson relayed that Henry Tyrrell, art critic for The World, had visited the gallery. Quote, "The art critic of The World, who is one of the few progressively minded critics in New York papers, stayed 2.5 hours with me," Weston wrote, "looking at and talking about the paintings. It was as fatiguing as a final exam. Don't repeat, but he said he thought mine was the biggest thing of its kind that had hit the New York art world in the past 2 years." High praise at a time when all kinds of things are happening. If we think about the early 20th century, in the late 19-teens, we had the Armory show, which sort of, it was a break for a lot of Americans in terms of American artists, in terms of thinking more broadly and internationally about their work. One of the pictures included in the 1922 exhibition was Sunrise, also known as Man in Nature. Writing to Faith on November 10th, 1922, Harold commented, quote, "Let me tell you, and repeat this to your parents, of about the best appreciation I have ever had of a painting. It occurred today. A woman came in with a little girl of about 7. The child at once started looking at the paintings with discriminating attention. She soon wandered down the gallery to the end of the room where sunrise hangs. There she stood, gazing at it fully 3 or 4 minutes, a long time of concentration for a mere child. Another artist and I were watching her from behind. Then she raised her arms and moved them unconsciously in the rhythmic movement of the figure, and she seemed to be pretending or feeling that she too was going off through the gateway of the 2 giant trees, floating off to the sunrise over the mountain ranges beyond. I was thrilled and amazed. Her mother saw us watching and later spoke to me saying what an inspiration to her the paintings were, and that she had encouraged her little girl who, with pardonable mother's pride, she thought had great talent. And this picture, when I talk about that kind of expressionistic energy, and we're going to talk a little more about Weston's sort of connection to the natural environment, this really does a great job of giving us a window into that. Sometimes referred to as the Thoreau of the Adirondacks, Weston's letters to faith reveal a spiritual kind of awareness of his surroundings. This glowing rendering of Giant Mountain, the same that we use in the introductory slide, seems to heave almost as if it is reflected in a kind of convex mirror, with the mountain's energy somehow feeding the vibrant sky and clouds above. Writing to Faith Borton on October 28, 1922, Harold commented, quote, "The hand of nature traces a pattern on our nerves as the etcher on the waxed plate and contact direct with it pours acid into those lines which bite deep into memory." There was too something acrid about the sunset, in the sense of burning, almost painful brilliance. Stenciled lines of gold jazzing up from behind ochreish purple ranges of looming hills, filamentous clouds that shot forth light as coils of illuminated electric wire in a globe, the great vault of the sky. Then, as suddenly the current of gold played out, the molten metal ran down, a few eddies lingering, down behind the western range. I think this little passage does a nice job of capturing sort of the fleeting effect of weather conditions on the mountains. Many of you probably have experienced those moments where you think, oh, if I could only get a picture of the sunset. And it never holds up, right? Because it's never the same as experiencing it. But it does pass quickly. The artist began his studio paintings with a rough charcoal sketch. Next, he painted in select outlines in a light key, filled in the most important areas, and adjusted colors and forms according to the mood and subject. Importantly, Weston felt he needed to, quote, keep the canvas moving, resisting the urge to complete one part of the picture until the majority of the composition was established. Weston wrote, quote, "This method of working out the problem on the canvas as you paint is open to more faults than less direct methods, but may give more living results. There is always tomorrow to scrape down and revise or discard." So when you see pictures like this, you have to think about that kind of patience and a creative mode of painting. Maybe you're not going to get it right the first time. Maybe you're going to have to sort of rework. Another thing worth noting is that the gilded frame that surrounds this landscape, as well as the previous rendering of Giant, was one of those 63 frames carved by Weston as original surrounds for the 1922 Montrose Gallery show. And I'll go back one. You'll notice that this frame has one type of molding. This has another. Each one of the frames was unique, and they were carved from pine that Weston had hewn. And they really are remarkable. The paintings are not huge in person, but they're very powerful in terms of their color. And the way that the gold plays off of the kind of undulating forms in these pictures is really, I think, to best effect. In a letter dated May 20th, 1922, Harold wrote to Faith, quote, "My letters are so long, I hope they don't bore you. Also, they're terribly self-centered. Of course, this life alone makes one somewhat so, and my excuse is that I want to give you every chance to get to know what sort of a guy this lanky, lonely lad is. He needs to be taken in hand soon, however, else bachelorhood will have erratically placed its hand of selfishness upon him. Start reforming America at home." On May 12th, 1923, almost a full year since Harold's initial thoughts of reformation, Faith and Harold were married. And these are pictures from their marriage in 1923. Pretty soon, Faith and Harold expanded the St. Hubert studio. And you'll see this image. You can see this sort of expansion on the side that faces us. It provided more room for both Harold and Faith, and more room for Harold's art practice. Soon after this, Harold painted Faith in a series of works that became known as Weston's, quote, landscape nudes. The moniker was derived from a comment that modernist painter John Marin made to Weston in 1925. Marin reportedly quipped, quote, "I feel the woods in these. Did you ever see mountains painted better than this?" And here we can see Faith, these lovely, lovely sort of the arc of her back, her legs. Weston also painted a number of introspective self-portraits like this one. This was painted in 1927 and is also going to be on display at the Adirondack Experience. It's interesting, Weston was not terrifically old in these pictures, but in many of his self-portraits, he seems to imagine himself as a sort of craggy old man. We're going to see another one at the very end of tonight's presentation that is sort of prescient in that way. But what I really love about many of them is that they are sort of aggressively engaged with the viewer. When you look at the gentleman in this picture, he is looking into your eyes. There is no doubt. Through those lovely round glasses with that pipe in his hand. You almost expect to see it sort of glow, right, with some heat. After a few years in St. Hubert's, Harold and Faith moved to France in 1926 for the sake of Harold's health. He had suffered from polio from the effects of polio since he was a child. And there were sort of flare-ups and other kinds of medical issues that popped up after that. In 1930, Weston returned to the United States with a renewed energy to paint. Rather than taking back up the mountains and expressive, expansive vistas of his youth, he began painting pictures that recorded elements of his daily life at home with his family. So here, this is a picture of my snowshoes. When we did the exhibition here in Shelburne back in 2019, the Harold Weston Foundation kindly loaned those snowshoes to us. And so it was a sort of lovely thing to have them in the gallery. But during this period in the 1930s, Weston increasingly moved toward realistic subjects, subjects that, whether they were things around his home, his pets, his family, inanimate objects that were sort of good for composition, these pictures were filled with them. But not for long. Harold and Faith first moved to New York City when they returned from France. The more representative realistic aesthetic that Weston had been exploring while abroad translated well into a commission from the Treasury Relief Art Project in 1936. Weston received this project, this commission to paint murals for the General Services Administration building in Washington, D.C. And here you'll see one of those elevations. So this is a huge sort of extended wall size, but you can really see in it where Weston has both engaged with ideas of what we would have thought of at the time as sort of American regionalism, the work of artists like Grant Wood, or even Paul Cadmus in some ways. He paints these really, really beautiful objects for us to sort of wander into. Weston also spent more time in Washington laboring at humanitarian causes. His early experience in the service had introduced him to some of the sort of more dire living conditions of people across the world. And from 1943 to 1947, Weston was heavily engaged with international famine relief efforts with the Food for Freedom movement. Weston also served as secretary of the Adirondack Trail Improvement Society from 1948 to 1968, 20 years, even designing their logo. And so those of you who head out into the woods in the coming weeks and months, when you see these, you will now know that the little drawing included on all of these trail tags is in fact by Harold Weston. From 1949 to 1952, Weston painted a series of 6 large canvases chronicling the building of the United Nations complex in New York City. These pictures were meant to represent the symbolic construction of international cooperation. Keep in mind, in the mid-20th century, right, we're coming out of 2 world wars. There is a lot of debate in the United States about what our country's role is abroad and how we foster a better world for everyone. And Harold was certainly on the more progressive end of that spectrum. spectrum. So this series of paintings that he created, they are now owned by the Smithsonian, but they are very, very large and very detailed. During the 1950s and 60s, Weston was also very active in terms of arguing for government support for the arts. This is a picture of Weston. So you see him on the left, shaking the hand of President Lyndon B. Johnson at the signing of the National Foundation on the Arts and Humanities Act in 1965. And when I was getting to know Harold Weston a few years ago, while we were working on the exhibition here at Shelburne, I think this was the part of his story that resonated with me the most. As an art historian who works in a cultural context, I'm so grateful for the kinds of federal funds and state funds that we receive, big public funds that we receive to keep programs going. But you don't get those kinds of things unless someone does the work. They don't just happen. And Weston was really at the forefront of thinking about how the government could help support a better life for everyone through the arts. By the mid-1960s, however, Weston found that his fervor for government work had subsided, and he began painting again in earnest. It was about this time that Weston began to focus on creating more abstract and occasionally surrealistic works of art. Keep in mind, Salvador Dali is alive at this time. There are all kinds of things happening in terms of the international art world. And this is where Weston's mind goes as he comes back from his sort of public service and leans in to his creative practice again. This picture, I'm sorry, I don't have a caption for you. I threw it in at the last minute because I thought you all might like to see it. Late in life, Harold Weston was inspired by dark gray rocks from Canada's Gaspé Peninsula to paint compositions in gouache, which is essentially opaque watercolor, on toned paper. The stones that you see here, streaked with white calcite bands and known as Iberville shale, were an endless source of ideas, holding Weston's attention for 4 years until his death. Together, between 1968 and 1972, Weston created 76 paintings that he called the Stone series. And these are the stones. We had them in the exhibition. They were loaned by the Harold Weston Foundation. And they really are sort of terrific if you can let your imagination run wild. I don't know if anyone out there is like me, but I'm constantly picking up things and putting them in my pockets and bringing them back. I was a shell collector as a child, and my pockets are often full of rocks that I pick up on walks with the dog. These are some particularly good examples of them. And what's going to be even more interesting is how you see how they get played out. So this is a work, this was number 4 in the Stone series. Some of Weston's earlier pictures between 1968 and 1972 that were created are a little more literal. So here in this composition, you get the idea that this is an actual rock or maybe 2 rocks that you're looking at. And he's positioned them in such a way for the picture plane that they look almost like a sperm whale. Hence the name Leviathan. So it's a kind of anthropomorphizing of these natural objects. You know, it would not have been too far afield in that this region up here was once an inland sea. And we know from fossils that there were whales and all kinds of things in previous periods that roamed this section of the planet. And so I will confess, this is probably my favorite of the stones. Weston wrote about the abstract direction his paintings were taking. He said, quote, "My recent work, though sometimes still imaginatively realistic or even slightly surrealistic, has turned more and more to abstraction. These are not pure abstractions, but they originate from some observed or felt natural form or movement of the sea, clouds, stones, a worm-chewed stick, a piece of wall fungus growth, or anything else. They have but one major objective: to express through juxtapositions of form, color, and suggested movement, whatever an inner force requires me to paint them at that time." So this work is called Rain Can Down. This was donated, this work is called Blue Beyond Blues. This is number 17 in the Stone series. And this work is called Rain Can Down. This was one of the stones that was donated to Shelburne Museum from the Weston Foundation in 2019. And so you can sort of see from The first one that I've shared with you, Leviathan, to Blue Beyond Blues, you have these lovely whorls. And then to Rain Can Down, they become increasingly abstracted, but you can also kind of almost catch the contours of a landscape, right? If you look about a third of the way up this page, you can almost imagine that that is like a mountainous ridgeline with big sort of sunrise or sunset street skies above. You really get that idea of contours. And if you go back all the way to the stones, you can now start to see how the striations in these particular objects get worked out in these larger washes on paper. Oh, this is another one of my favorites. This is a later stone, but this one is called Suspense. It's number 62 in the series and was created in 1970. And this is, some of the colors in these, they're pastels and gouache on paper. And so they are really vibrant. And sometimes, especially the later stones, become almost psychedelic. The rhythmic, brightly colored whorls and streaks that characterize the inner world of the stone series then are reminiscent of the peaks, lakes, and grand landscapes of Weston's beloved Adirondack wilderness. This place card, painted by Harold Weston when he was just 15, does a remarkable job of highlighting just how closely tied art and identity were for the young man. This will just about wrap it up for my comments, but before we take your questions, I'd like to extend my most sincere thanks to Cheryl and the team at the Adirondack Experience who've made this webinar possible. I owe a further huge debt to Nina Weston Foster and Rebecca Foster, Weston's daughter and granddaughter respectively. Nina and Rebecca generously introduced me to Harold's extensive body of work, as well as an extensive collection of journals, correspondence, and related ephemera back in 2019, when Shelburne Museum featured the exhibition Harold Weston, Freedom in the Wilds. Without their dedication and attention to detail, we would not be able to access much of the magic of Weston's legacy. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Cheryl for any questions that you all might have.
Thank you, Katie. That was so wonderful. And I don't think I'm ever going to look at some of the stones that I see the same way. That was, it was just beautiful. And I've got a question before we actually start hearing from some of the attendees this evening. But one of the things that you mentioned early in the presentation was his use of those thick brush strokes. And it seemed like as he progressed, that really went away. And it's such an incredible change. I mean, obviously, the subject that he is showing, the materials that he's using, so much changed over the course of his career.
Yeah, it really did. Those early oil paintings, we have to kind of think of them in the same context as artists like Marsden Hartley are working. These sort of artists who are pushing past the ideas that the Impressionists and even the American Impressionists had sort of left us with, but who are really thinking about using paint as a material on the canvas to convey energy, and using color to convey all kinds of emotions, right? So there's also something interesting, and I remember talking with Rebecca and Nina about this. Some of Weston, so Weston goes to Harvard for 4 years, right? And he gets his formal education. And then he starts to take classes in New York because he'd gone as a fine arts student. He'd graduated, he was very smart, he was engaged. But as he started to take classes at places like the Art Students League in New York, or even when he went out to Ogunquit, he noticed that the sort of drivers behind his creation were different than those of many of his fellow artists. And the kinds of things that he was being directed to create in art school, it was almost like it was a little too pedagogical for him. He really wanted to kind of get away and make things his own way. And so with many of those pictures that we see from that first period in St. Hubert's, the sketches and the finished paintings are absolutely thick with paint. When they came in for the show in 2019, it was astounding to look at them in raking light. And that from a material perspective can be challenging too, if a canvas isn't prepped properly, right? And he's working out of the woods, so he's got limited supplies sometimes. And he has to sort of make do with what he's got. One of the things that is very surprising about these works is the combination of all of this impasto and texture on the canvas, but the fact that they really aren't that big. They do contain these huge ideas, but just bottled up in this very dense packaging. So they're lovely works to look at. Later, as he goes through and starts to work with different materials, his sense of form and I guess you could say his desire to depict things realistically as they are in life seems to develop a little bit more. And I guess you could argue that, maybe there's something to be said about this and how it relates to his work on other causes, right? As he's starting to work with the government on not just things like humanitarian efforts, but on, securing federal arts funding and sort of making those things go forward. That if you work within the government, like it is bureaucracy. And so you either have to get on board with it and figure out how to use it to your advantage, or things don't happen. And so I've always thought, I don't know if Nina and Rebecca would agree with this, but I've always thought that maybe that change in his painting had to do with this kind of desire to kind of conform to the standards that he needed to conform to make these bigger projects that he really wanted to move forward. That's speculation, though. I don't, maybe I've thought too hard about it.
Well, we did receive a question actually about the his early work, and I along with that, I'll get to the question in just a second, but Katie, somebody's actually asked if there's a way for you to run your slides as background during the Q&A. I'm not sure if it's set up as a PowerPoint and you could set that up or not. If not, we do record all these programs, and I do encourage everybody, if you want to see this again or look at the images, excuse me, we will be posting it later on this week. And then obviously both the Adirondack Experience, the Shelburne Museum, obviously the Smithsonian, there's a lot of works that are available at different museum sites. So we do welcome you to explore those as well. But the question came up about his early work and whether or not he was influenced by any Europeans, perhaps some of the German artists.
Yes. So something interesting happens in American art after 1917. And what happens is that there's this big show in New York, and it's called the Armory Show. And the Armory Show brings together all kinds of work from all over the world. And so there's typically when you study American art, there's this sort of cutoff at 1945 after World War II. And sort of modernist art takes off from there. And if you're an Americanist like me, you generally study the objects before that. Harold Weston sort of bridges those gaps. We see both in his work and his writings a kind of cosmopolitan flair. He's aware of what's going on in Europe. He had traveled extensively, doing sort of grand tour sorts of things with his family at a young age. One of the best parts of working with the foundation on the exhibition in 2019 was that they had all of Weston's journals and diaries from this period. And even when he was a young child, sort of writing and keeping these logs, there are beautiful sketches within these books. And you get a sense that he's aware that he's not the center of the universe, right? He's aware that there's so much more going on. And so that question about, where is he getting influence from? It certainly has to do with modern art. It certainly has to do with international art. It also, the reception of his work in 1922 and beyond. Keep in mind, while he's painting expressionistically, and by that I mean he's using color and form to sort of express energy and larger ideas like, a spiritual sense of nature, or this sort of energy that emanates from the earth, or the way that his eyes see it, right? Those fleeting moments of sunset or sunrise. In addition to that, at the same time that Weston is painting these objects, he's starting to see the rise around him of artists that are what we would come to call the abstract expressionists, right? And like the number one when I was teaching, the number one abstract expressionist you bring up that's easy for people to know is Jackson Pollock, right? Now Pollock was later, but that idea of paintings of movement that are non-figural, that I think also probably had a significant influence on how Weston thought about his figural work. When I say figural, I don't necessarily mean the human figure. I mean, you're seeing things on the canvas that you can identify. One of the nice things about this show, when we were putting it together, is I grew up in Central Florida, and so there were no mountains where I grew up. And when I moved to Vermont, I'll go hiking up, peaks on this side of Lake Champlain, and I can see the high peaks. And after I had spent a couple months looking at Weston's paintings, I could identify them, which was pretty cool. There was that much specificity in his work, right? So I hope that answers the question.
It does. And somebody actually is asking a related one as far as some of the other influences. Somebody's wondering whether or not Weston and Winslow Homer knew each other at all.
Oh, so I'm not aware if they knew one another. I don't think so. And the reason that I say that is I don't think they were really running in the same circles. Here's why. We know that Homer was trained as both an artist who could paint and an artist who could go out and make a living as an illustrator. And we know, right, that as he's painting, he's also creating pictures that will be turned into engravings for serial publications like newspapers or magazines. And that kind of for-profit work was not so much what Weston was aiming at early on. Or if he was, I'm very unaware of it. Weston really, when he packed up his, paints and took off for the mountains, it was really to kind of get away from a lot of what was going on out in the art world. It was a place that he didn't really feel a tight kinship with. He felt like maybe it was a little constricting for him. And so if they had met, I don't know how that would have gone. Homer, of course, was prolific, and they both certainly were well-known artists within their lifetimes. But I don't know. That's a great question.
We do have a related one. I did want to, excuse me, let everybody know a clarification from Rebecca Foster, who is Harold Weston's granddaughter and who we're very fortunate is watching this evening. And she want to clarify that Weston was an activist and he actually was pushing against bureaucracy. So thank you for that clarification. Back to other artists that Weston might have known. Somebody is asking if he knew Georgia O'Keeffe at all, and especially with her time at Lake George.
At Lake George. Again, he doesn't mention her to the best of my knowledge. And, she would have been tied in with Stieglitz. I feel like I don't know.
And then I think we've got one more on the same topic, whether or not he knew Rockwell Kent. So lots of artists picking the Adirondacks, and everybody's trying to make a link between them.
Right. Well, and that I think, whether or not I can give you the specifics is one thing. But what you're seeing through these references to Georgia O'Keeffe and Rockwell Kent and Winslow Homer, you're seeing, I think, a kind of reflection or acknowledgement of what is in the larger sort of ether in the art world at this time, right? There is this increasing focus on ideas of sort of regional painting and modernism and what modernism means, right? Because like people have been calling themselves modernists for a long time. In the 1870s, there were French painters who thought of them as modernists because they were painting modern life. And that certainly works, but there's a different kind of capital M modern that starts to creep in the 20th century. And I think when you pair that with the fact that, and Rebecca's absolutely right, Harold's activism had to do with reducing the sort of barriers between artists and the things that help them to live. And so when we think about that, this time period, it's a time period of great social programs, big sort of innovations in terms of what we think of about how the government might be able to help people live better lives, and what the government's role might be in that, what it should be in that, what it could be in that, all those kinds of things. And so I think what you're seeing is that there are a lot of artists who are grappling with these kinds of big questions. And they're trying to create images of place that reflect this sort of thing that's in the larger conversation.
Well, that does bring up an interesting next question, which is a very tangible one. I think, unfortunately, a lot of people can be very sympathetic about, which was how was Weston himself funded? How was he, was he commercial? Like, how was he painting and making a living?
Yeah, that's also a good question. So Weston was fortunate in that he came from a comfortable family. So he was able to do this in some ways that, perhaps some other people would not have been able to. But he also really took it upon himself to try to sort of make his own way in the world. And what I mean by that is when Faith and Harold return from the sort of health sojourn in Europe in 1930, one of the things that Rebecca and I talked about a little bit a couple years ago was this sort of move to New York and this sort of like dilapidated place that they were living in, right? Like, and it's stressful. It's stressful on a young marriage. It's both Faith and Harold were from families that valued education and had the means to supply that to their children. For a young woman, especially, going to college at this time, there were a lot of young women who did not have that kind of privilege. And so that certainly is underwriting Weston's work. But I can't emphasize enough how much he was really getting out and sort of beating the pavement in terms of promoting his work and trying to sort of have a critical reception for it. And Montross was really key in all of that. He sort of helped Weston to understand, how to work the ropes, and then provided a forum for critical reception, which was really, really important. With the internet now, right, we can see images all of the time, but it wasn't always that way. And so having a forum where someone had enough faith in you to say, all right, you say you need a show. I like what I'm seeing so far. Get me an entire exhibit's worth of material in the next 6 months. Like it's a tall order, right? And that the fact that he also created the frames to go with many of those works is just remarkable. And I can't stress enough for visitors to your galleries who will have the privilege of seeing at least one of those. They really do make the paintings. They're great.
I love the fact that, we can talk about frames. It's a whole other discussion at some point. So you talked a little bit about Faith and Harold, and we do have a question. Somebody wanted to know a little bit more about them. Obviously, we've touched upon the fact that they did have children. Somebody's asking if his health improved with age. So just a little bit more about the two of them and their personal life.
Oh, so in terms of personal life, we know that Harold and Faith had children. And from all accounts, Harold was for most accounts, Harold was a kind of distant father in some of those ways. Faith had it hard for many years, and that Weston was certainly preoccupied by his work. Under the aegis of, providing for his family and needing to be able to do that. But reminisces from the family have seemed to lean toward, he was a sort of distant dad for a long time. And so that's tough. And it's hard to think about that right now in some ways, because our ideas of what makes a family, how a family is shaped, our ideas of gender roles and all those things, you know, they have shifted significantly in the 100 years since most of these works were created, right? So it's hard to talk about that in an objective way. But I think that I think Faith probably would have also said that, you know, by the time Harold started working on more sort of activist kinds of things, more of the sort of governmental work, more of the humanitarian causes, that took him away from New York to Washington, D.C., and certainly took him away from his family for long stretches of time.
So switching directions here, somebody's taking a closer look at one of his works and brought up sugar maples. And the comment is, I see an old man on the left of the tree walking, and on the right of the tree, a person with long dark hair and a red cloak. Is there really people there, or am I taking shapes and inventing my own narrative? I love that question.
So, okay, I will confess, I don't see them, but that doesn't mean that they're not there. And one of the reasons that I really enjoy this particular picture is that it makes my eyes do this funny thing, right? And whether Weston was engaging with formal like color theory, or he was just painting what he saw, right? There are definitely days in the fall when I look around Vermont and New York, and you see the trees silhouetted against the sky, and they're so bright you can't see the leaves, especially the sugar maples, right? With their sort of that like crimson to coral color that they do. I with a lot of these expressionistic works, especially the sketches, I think it's easy to see all kinds of things in there. You just need the right, you know, set and setting.
All right, I think we've got time for about one more question. So switching back again to his public service. So we've got a question about Harold Weston's involvement in the creation of the New York State Council of the Arts, and being asked to help out with that by Nelson Rockefeller, and wondering whether or not you had any information on that. Have you ever found any documentation about his involvement with the creation of the Council for the Arts?
I do not. I haven't really delved deep into that aspect of his career, or of his, here's the right word, of all of the awesome things that he sort of left us with. But I can say that during the period of time when he's working on all of these things, you know, the Rockefellers were really instrumental in thinking about wildlands, and in establishing vast tracts of open wilderness where the land would really be set aside in perpetuity. And, you know, in days since, we've gotten used to the idea of, oh, that's land trust land, that'll never be developed. But it wasn't always like this. Just like things like federal funding for the arts or state funding for the arts, like land doesn't just get saved from development. You have to sort of have a plan. And so I think, you know, Weston was probably tapped to work on those kinds of things because he had this deep, really visceral connection with the Adirondack High Peaks region. And he knew it well enough. He knew it like the back of his hand, right? He had gone out and bushwhacked trails himself. He had spent nights out in the woods with his sort of bum leg from polio, not stopping him. And I think it's part of the sort of larger conversation around all of these sort of progressive social forces that we see emerging during that period.
Well, Katie, we are running out of time on this, and I really want to thank, especially for joining us, the Weston family. There's been a lot of input from his daughter, his granddaughter, and we're truly grateful for that input, and especially for all the work that Katie did. So thank you all for joining us tonight. As I mentioned, this program has been recorded, and the Adirondack Experience will get it up on our website as fast as we can this week. Our next Artist Inspiration program will be April 10th, when our own Chief Curator, Laura Rice, will present a program devoted solely to the upcoming exhibition and many of the works that will be featured in it. We hope that you can join us for that, and the registration information for that program is popping up in the chat. Next week, we bring back our popular spring series, Dax Dishes, in collaboration with the Albany Public Library. This year's theme is mushrooms, so something tasty for everybody. And again, information is in the chat. And again, summer's not truly all that far off, but we do want to encourage all of you to think about becoming a member of the Adirondack Experience if you aren't already part of our family. While our Zoom series continues to be free for everybody, as a member, you benefit from many exclusive 80Kicks perks, including free admission for the entire season and an invitation to come and see Artist Inspiration before it opens for the public. Finally, we can't do any of these programs without the generosity of our donors. So please feel free to show your appreciation for everything that we do by supporting the museum. And I wish all of you a wonderful evening. Stay safe out there in the snow. And especially Katie, thank you so much for joining us. This has been absolutely wonderful. Thanks, everybody. Good night.